August 17th, 1945, Crystal City, Texas. Dust swirled across the camp as the voice cut through the afternoon heat. "Line up, girls." The Japanese women froze. Their hands trembled. Their hollow eyes darted between the barbed wire fence and the tall American cowboys standing before them. Every breath felt like betrayal. Every heartbeat whispered the same warning they'd been taught since childhood. The enemy shows no mercy. They had been told Americans were savage men who tortured, starved, and humiliated prisoners without hesitation. They had prepared themselves for violence, for degradation, for death. What they weren't prepared for was what came next. As they stood in that Texas dirt, watching the cowboys remove their hats and gesture toward the barracks, a terrible realization began to form one that would shatter everything they believed. The monsters they feared were about to offer them kindness, and that terrified them more than any cruelty ever could. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether you're in Tokyo, Berlin, New York, or anywhere else in the world. These stories of humanity emerging from the darkness of war need to be remembered and shared. Your engagement helps keep these forgotten moments of history alive. Act I, the indoctrination. To understand the tears that would come, you must first understand the lies. By 1945, Japan had spent 15 years constructing an ideology of absolute obedience. The women standing in that Texas dust hadn't simply been taught military doctrine. They'd been psychologically reconstructed from childhood. Every schoolgirl in Japan memorized the Senjinkan, the military code that declared surrender worse than death. Every young woman learned that capture meant eternal dishonor, not just for herself, but for her entire family line. The propaganda films showed American soldiers as demonic creatures with twisted faces, laughing as they committed unspeakable acts. Radio broadcasts assured civilians that captured Japanese women would be tortured, raped, then executed. It wasn't presented as possibility. It was presented as certainty. Kiyomi had been 17 when the war consumed her world. Born in Hiroshima Prefecture, she'd grown up in a modest household where her father crafted furniture and her mother tended a small vegetable garden. She remembered the exact moment everything changed, the day the military officers visited her school and selected 20 girls for special service. Her parents wept but said nothing. To refuse would brand the family as traitors. So Kiyomi went, clutching her mother's photograph, convinced she was serving the divine emperor. What followed were months of training that systematically dismantled her sense of self. The instructors showed films of American atrocities, some real, most fabricated. They conducted drills where girls practiced suicide rather than surrender. They recited pledges declaring that death was preferable to the shame of capture. The numbers tell part of the story. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 250,000 Japanese civilians were mobilized for military support roles. Women served as nurses, factory workers, and communications specialists. But the psychological conditioning extended far beyond these official roles. It penetrated every aspect of Japanese society. School children donated their metal lunchboxes to be melted down for weapons. Housewives handed over family heirlooms. The entire nation operated under a philosophy called gyukusai, shattering like a jewel. the idea that honorable destruction was infinitely preferable to disgraceful survival. When Japan's defeat became inevitable in the summer of 1945, Kiyomi found herself among a group of women transferred through a chaotic series of military transports. The atomic bombs had fallen, cities burned. The Emperor's surrender broadcast crackled through broken radios, his voice distorted and surreal. Many women chose suicide in those final days rather than face capture. Kiyomi couldn't explain why she didn't join them. Perhaps exhaustion had dulled her indoctrination. Perhaps some buried instinct for survival overrode her training. She boarded the American transport ship in a state of numb resignation, certain she was being taken to her execution. The 3-week journey across the Pacific felt like sailing into darkness. Then, on that August afternoon, the transport arrived at Crystal City, Texas. The women descended from the trucks, blinking in the brutal sunlight. They wore the remnants of military uniforms, faded, torn, stained with the grime of defeat. Their bodies bore the physical evidence of war's cruelty. Malnutrition had hollowed their faces. Stress had grayed their hair prematurely. Dysentery and untreated infections had weakened many to the point of collapse. The average weight among the women was 87 pounds. They ranged in age from 16 to 28, though most looked decades older. As they stood before the ranch buildings, a cowboy stepped forward, his face weathered and lined, his boots scuffed with Texas clay. He spoke in English, which most didn't understand, but his tone was neither harsh nor mocking. It was simply matter of fact. "Line up, girls." They obeyed, forming a ragged line. Their eyes remained fixed on the ground. To make eye contact with the enemy was to invite violence, or so they believed. But as the minutes passed and no violence came, confusion began to replace terror. The cowboys walked among them with clipboards, making notes, their expressions neutral. No one sneered. No one touched them roughly. No one raised a weapon. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the women were directed toward a low building with screened windows. The barracks. Kiyomi entered last, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. Inside, the air smelled of fresh-cut pine and lye soap. 20 narrow beds lined the walls, each with a wool blanket folded at the foot. Real beds, not the lice-infested mats they'd slept on during their final months in Japan. Not the cold metal floors of the transport ship. Actual beds with mattresses. Several women stood motionless, staring at the beds as though they might vanish if approached too quickly. One girl, barely 16, reached out and touched a blanket, then jerked her hand back as if burned. The softness was incomprehensible. Then came the food. The door opened and 2 cowboys entered carrying metal trays. The smell hit first rich, savory, overwhelming. Beef stew with chunks of actual meat. Mashed potatoes glistening with butter. Fresh baked bread that steamed when torn open. And bacon crispy strips of bacon that crackled with fat and salt. Kiyomi stared at her tray in disbelief. She hadn't seen meat in 8 months. The rations in Japan's final year had consisted of rice mixed with sawdust, seaweed soup so thin you could see through it, and occasionally sweet potato stems. Thousands had starved. Thousands more survived on barely 800 calories per day. Yet here, in the enemy's hands, sat a meal that contained more nutrition than she'd consumed in the previous week combined. She looked at the other women. Some had already begun eating, tears streaming down their faces as they chewed. Others sat frozen, the food untouched, wrestling with the same terrible question that paralyzed Kiyomi. Why would the enemy feed us like this if they planned to kill us? The propaganda had never prepared them for this possibility. Cruelty they could understand. Violence made sense within the framework of war, but kindness, generosity, these things didn't fit the narrative they'd been given. And in that moment, standing in a Texas barracks with a tray of food that seemed too good to be real, Kiyomi felt the first hairline crack form in the foundation of everything she believed. She picked up the spoon, her hand shook. She brought it to her lips and tasted the stew, and the tears came, hot and uncontrollable, because the food was real and she was alive and none of it made any sense at all. Act 2. The Unlearning. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Kiyomi woke to sunlight streaming through the barracks windows, momentarily disoriented. Memory returned. Texas. Capture the strange meal the night before. Her body ached, but not as hollowed as before. Other women stirred, standing at windows, staring at the ranch with confusion. Outside, cowboys began their routines, feeding horses, checking fences, living ordinary lives, while the world slowly ended around them. A bell rang not harsh, just a simple dinner bell. The women gathered. An older cowboy with kind eyes gestured them to follow. Beneath a cottonwood, breakfast waited. Scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits with jam, fresh milk. Kiyomi ate slowly, each bite a shock. Prisoners weren't supposed to eat like this. Afterward, the cowboys assigned tasks. Kiyomi was told to feed the chickens, a simple, absurdly normal job. Months of survival, dodging bombs, rationing water, watching friends die, had prepared her for everything but this. At the coop she scattered grain as instructed. The chickens pecked eagerly, and something inside her shifted a stone settling at the bottom of a pond. Days passed in repetition. Work, meals, rest. No one screamed. Mistakes were quietly corrected. Kindness accumulated. One evening a cowboy returned with a wool blanket for Kiyomi. She cried, uncomprehending, as the simple decency pierced her indoctrination. By the week's end, the women spoke quietly among themselves, questioning everything they'd believed. What if the propaganda was wrong? What if Americans weren't monsters? Every act of normalcy eroded certainty. On the 10th day, a young American girl approached the fence, offering a red ribbon. Kiyomi accepted it with trembling fingers and tied it in her hair that evening, a small acknowledgment of her own humanity. Her reflection barely resembled the hollow girl she had been. Confusion replaced certainty, and she realized confusion was preferable to hollow obedience. That evening, music rose near the fire of banjo, harmonica, guitar. Folk songs of home, harvest, simple joys, untainted by ideology. Kiyomi closed her eyes and let it wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Act 3, The Reckoning. The letter changed everything. 3 weeks into their captivity, the cowboys distributed paper and pencils. The message was simple. The women could write home. Kiyomi stared at the blank page, frozen. What could she say? Hiroshima was gone. Her parents might be dead. And here she was safe, fed, alive in the hands of the enemy. At last she wrote, I am safe. The Americans have treated us with a kindness I do not understand, but I am alive. Folding the letter felt like both betrayal and freedom. The truth contradicted everything she had been taught, yet she could not deny it. To send the letter was to admit the lie. Other women struggled too. Some rewrote their letters endlessly. Others wrote only a few words. I live. They do not harm us. Even that felt revolutionary. In the fourth week, showers were built behind the barracks. Hot water, soap, towels. Kiyomi stood in line, overwhelmed. Cleanliness had become a forgotten luxury. When warm water touched her skin, she scrubbed it until the dirt and something deeper washed away. She cried for the women who had died believing mercy did not exist, for those who chose death over surrender, for the lives lost to lies. Afterward she felt exposed, not just clean, but stripped of certainty. The world no longer fit the shape she had been given. Days settled into routine work, meals, cautious conversations. The women learned English phrases. The cowboys tried Japanese badly. These awkward exchanges became bridges across years of propaganda. One afternoon, a cowboy offered Kiyomi warm bread. Their hands brushed. The enemy's hand was simply human calloused, warm, real. He had shown her more kindness than her own military ever had. She ate slowly, accepting what that meant. The walls she'd built were crumbling. If these people weren't monsters, then everything she had believed had been a lie. The emotional toll was heavy. Some women withdrew. Others raged at the government, the emperor, themselves. A few insisted the kindness was manipulation. But as weeks passed, resistance softened. The Americans could have been cruel. They chose compassion. Repatriation loomed. Japan lay in ruins. None knew what waited family, rejection, disbelief. At night, Kiyomi stared at the barracks ceiling, realizing survival meant more than living through war. It meant living with the truth that everything she'd been taught was wrong, and learning how to carry that knowledge forward. Yet there was also something new growing in the space left by the shattered lies. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. The possibility of rebuilding herself around truth instead of propaganda. The possibility of defining her own humanity rather than having it dictated by empire and war. The possibility of choosing dignity over death. Resolution. The long journey home. September 15th, 1945. San Francisco Harbor. The repatriation ship waited at the dock, its hull painted white with red crosses. A vessel that had once carried wounded soldiers now repurposed to return prisoners to their shattered homeland. The women gathered on the pier, their belongings packed in small cloth bundles. They had been at the ranch for 4 weeks, barely a month, yet it felt like a lifetime. They were heavier now, their bodies filling out with proper nutrition. Their faces had regained some color. Their eyes, while still haunted, no longer held the vacant stare of those who had given up. They wore clean clothes provided by the American Red Cross, simple dresses and sturdy shoes, donated by women across Texas who would never meet the people they had helped. As Kiyomi waited to board, one of the cowboys approached, the older man who had given her the first blanket. He removed his hat and nodded to her, a gesture of respect that required no translation. She bowed in return, a deeper bow than protocol required, because she didn't have words for what she wanted to convey. He had shown her that the enemy could be human. That gift, more than the food or shelter or safety, had saved something essential in her that war had nearly destroyed. The ship's horn sounded. The women began filing up the gangplank. Kiyomi paused at the top and looked back at the distant ranch, at the men standing on the dock, at the country that had treated her better than her own. Then she turned and stepped onto the ship, carrying with her a truth that would take the rest of her life to fully understand. The Pacific crossing took 3 weeks. The ship moved slowly through waters that had so recently been filled with warships and submarines, through seas where thousands had drowned fighting a war that now felt both ancient and immediate. The women gathered on deck in the evenings, watching the sun set over the horizon, speaking quietly about what they would say when they reached Japan. Some planned to tell the truth about their treatment. Others feared they would never be believed. A few decided to remain silent, to bury the experience beneath survival, and simply try to rebuild lives from the wreckage. When the ship finally reached Yokohama Harbor in October 1945, Kiyomi stood at the railing and looked at her homeland. The city was broken. Buildings stood in skeletal ruins. Smoke still rose from districts that had burned months ago. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, scavenging for food among the rubble. This was what she had returned to, a nation that had sacrificed everything for an ideology of supremacy and conquest, only to discover that ideology was built on lies. She walked down the gangplank on unsteady legs. Japanese officials processed the returning prisoners with cold efficiency questions asked. Forms stamped no interest in what they had endured. There was no welcome. They were discharged and told to find their own way home. Kiyomi boarded a train toward Hiroshima, unsure if her family had survived. Outside the window lay abandoned rice fields, empty villages, shattered bridges hastily repaired. The country bore the scars of defeat. Yet she saw something propaganda had never shown her. People rebuilding, planting, choosing to continue. Her neighborhood was gone. Within the bomb's radius, only foundations and twisted metal remained. On the outskirts, survivors had built shelters from scrap. Moving through these makeshift streets, Kiyomi asked about her family until someone pointed her toward a small shack by a canal. Her mother opened the door, older, grayer, but alive. They stared, then collapsed into each other, weeping. Her father had survived. Her younger brother had not. The family was diminished, but endured like the nation itself. In the weeks that followed, Kiyomi tried to explain Texas. Her parents listened in disbelief. Kind Americans contradicted everything they had been taught. Her father said little, but she saw doubt take root, the sense that the war and its sacrifices may have been built on lies. She spoke of it to no one. Post-war Japan was dangerous ground for such truths. Some clung to honor. Others chose silence. Kiyomi chose memory. She kept the red ribbon an American girl had given her and thought often of the cowboys, the meals, the blankets, the decency. She came to understand that war's greatest tragedy is not only death, but the lies that make it possible. Decades later, she told her story to researchers. She spoke carefully, refusing romance, insisting only on truth. That in Texas in 1945, she learned enemies could choose kindness, and that humanity can survive even when everything else is lost.